First contact. Princess Zyra took a deep breath, but it did not calm her. Her heart was still racing. The room was cold, but her hands felt warm, almost burning. She clenched them into fists, forcing herself to stay calm. This was just a meeting, a simple conversation, nothing more. And yet, she had never been this nervous before. The door in front of her was thick, made of black metal. It was the only thing separating her from the one she had come to meet. A human soldier. A real human. Zyra had read stories about them. Ruthless, unpredictable, dangerous. Her people feared them. Even the greatest warriors in her kingdom spoke of humans with both respect and fear. They were not the strongest or the fastest species in the galaxy, but they were something far worse. They never gave up. And now, she had to meet one. Speak to him. Negotiate with him. She swallowed hard as the door hissed open. A tall figure stepped inside. Princess Zyra's breath caught in her throat. The human soldier was nothing like she expected. His uniform was dark, with battle-worn armor plates over his chest and arms. His posture was straight, confident, but relaxed, like a predator that didn't need to prove its strength. His eyes, a cold shade of gray, studied her with a calm expression. Not cruel, not angry, just watching. His face had scars, deep old scars. They told a story of survival. Zyra felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Not fear, not disgust, something else. The soldier took another step forward. Her instincts screamed at her to step back, but she did not. She was a princess. She would not show weakness. Then he spoke. "You look nervous." His voice was deep, steady, with no emotion. Zyra forced herself to breathe. She lifted her chin slightly. "I am not." The soldier tilted his head, as if studying her. Then, very slowly, he smirked. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much. Someone who knew things she did not. Zyra's fingers twitched. For a moment, she wished she had brought a weapon. "I expected more guards," the soldier said, looking around the empty room. "I do not need guards," she replied quickly. The human raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" There was something in his tone, not mockery, but curiosity. He was testing her, measuring her. She hated that feeling. She took a slow step forward. "Your name is Commander Ryan Cole," she said. "You are one of the most decorated soldiers in the human fleet." Ryan shrugged. "Some would say that." "Then why do you fight?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "What do humans fight for?" "Power. Control." Ryan's smirk disappeared. His gray eyes turned serious. For the first time, Zyra felt a strange shift in the air. "We fight to survive," he said simply. His voice was quiet, but there was weight behind it. Zyra didn't know how to respond. She had met many warriors, strong, proud, loud. But this human, he was different. She had expected aggression, arrogance, maybe even cruelty. But what she saw in his eyes was something far more dangerous. Conviction. Zyra had read about human history, their wars, their victories, their refusal to surrender. Many alien races had tried to destroy them, to break them. None had succeeded. Now, standing face to face with one of their greatest warriors, she understood why. Ryan studied her for a moment longer. Then he spoke again. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Zyra's breath hitched. The way he asked the question, it was not a threat. It was almost amused, as if he was challenging her. She forced herself to hold his gaze. She would not back down. "No," she said, her voice steady. Ryan's smirk returned, but this time there was something different in his expression. Something almost approving. Zyra didn't understand why, but it made her heart beat faster. The silence stretched between them. For the first time in her life, she did not know if she was the one in control. Then Ryan leaned slightly forward. "Good," he said. Before Zyra could react, the door behind him slammed open. A royal guard rushed in, his face pale with fear. "Princess, we have an emergency." Zaira turned sharply. "What is it?" The guard's voice shook as he spoke. "The Drak Empire has launched an attack. They are here. They are already inside the palace." A cold chill ran down Zaira's spine. She turned back to Ryan. The human soldier had not moved. His expression had not changed. Instead, he reached down to his belt and pulled out a small, sleek weapon. He looked at Zaira, then at the guard. Then he sighed, almost as if he was bored. "Well," Ryan said, "looks like our meeting just got more interesting." The soldier's eyes. The room fell silent. The only sound was the distant thunder of explosions as the palace trembled under attack. Zaira's pulse quickened. The Drak were here, inside her home. She had known this day would come, but not this soon. Not now, not when she was already standing in front of a human. The royal guard beside her was breathing heavily, gripping his weapon too tightly. He was waiting for her order, waiting for her to decide. But Zaira hesitated. Then she heard something strange. Laughter. Soft, quiet, but unmistakable. She turned sharply to face Ryan. The human soldier was smiling. It wasn't a cruel smile. Not arrogant. But something worse. It was the smile of a man who had seen this before, who had walked through fire and come out the other side. He wasn't afraid. Not even a little. "Princess," Ryan said, his voice almost casual, as if they were discussing the weather. "You need to start moving. Now." Zaira hated the way he said it. Not like a request. Not like an order. But like a simple, unavoidable fact. The guard turned to her, expecting a command. But Ryan, he wasn't waiting for permission. He took a step toward the door. Zaira instinctively stepped in his path. The human stopped. Their eyes met. Zaira's breath caught again. Ryan's gray eyes were steady, unshaken. There was no panic, no fear, just calculated focus. He was already thinking ahead, already preparing for whatever came next. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was in control of this situation, not her. Zaira forced herself to stand taller. She was a princess. The Drak had invaded her home. This was her battle. She would not let some human mercenary take command. But Ryan spoke first. "Do you have weapons?" he asked. Zaira stiffened. "I." Ryan's eyes flickered to the royal guard's trembling hands. Then back to Zaira. His smirk returned, but this time it was different. Less amused. More knowing. "You don't, do you?" Zaira's fists clenched. "I do not need a weapon," she said through gritted teeth. "I have guards. I have warriors." Ryan raised an eyebrow. Then he tilted his head slightly, just enough to dodge the sudden burst of gunfire that exploded through the doorway. The royal guard beside Zaira screamed. Everything happened too fast. The first Drak warrior stormed into the room, his rifle aimed at Zaira's chest. For a single heartbeat, she froze. The Drak was tall, taller than Ryan, with thick, gray skin and sharp, reptilian features. His armor gleamed under the dim light. His black eyes locked onto her. Then a shadow moved. Ryan. Zaira barely saw it happen, only a blur of motion before the human lunged forward. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Ryan caught the Drak's wrist before the alien could fire, twisting it with a brutal, unnatural strength. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the room. The Drak roared in pain. Ryan didn't stop. In a single fluid motion, he ripped the rifle from the enemy's hand, spun it around, and fired twice. The Drak's body hit the floor before Zaira even understood what had happened. Silence. The royal guard was shaking. Zaira herself could only stare. Ryan stood over the fallen enemy, his face completely calm. No triumph, no anger, just cold efficiency. He turned his head slightly, looking at Zaira. "That's why you need a weapon," he said simply. For the first time, Zaira had no response. Another explosion shook the palace, snapping her out of her trance. The battle outside was growing worse. The Drakh were everywhere. Ryan sighed, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. "We need to get out of here," he said. Zira swallowed her pride. She hated it, but he was right. Her home was under attack, and she couldn't afford to stand here arguing with a human. She turned to the guard. "Alert the others. Gather whoever is still standing and lead them to the royal bunker." The guard hesitated. "And you, princess?" Zara hesitated. Ryan answered for her. "She's coming with me," he said. Zira snapped her gaze to him. "Excuse me." Ryan didn't even look at her. He was already checking the fallen Drakh's weapons, inspecting them with practiced ease. "You won't make it to the bunker," he said, slinging the stolen rifle over his shoulder. "Too many enemies, and I don't think your soldiers are ready for this fight." Zira's pride burned, but she knew he was right. The guard standing next to her was still shaking. Ryan finally turned his gaze back to her. "You want to survive this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Then stick with me." For a moment, Zira wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him she didn't need his help. But the Drakh were coming, more than before. She could hear their footsteps, their growls. And so, against everything she had ever believed, against everything her people had taught her about humans, she made a choice. She nodded. Ryan didn't smile, didn't smirk. He simply turned and started walking. Zira followed, and as she stepped over the lifeless Drakh body on the floor, she realized something. She had never seen anyone move the way Ryan had. Never seen a warrior fight like that. He was dangerous, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And yet, for the first time that day, she didn't feel afraid. The unwanted alliance. The palace corridors stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the eerie glow of flickering emergency lights. The distant echoes of battle rang through the walls. Shouts, gunfire, the unmistakable hum of Drakh plasma weapons. Zira's mind was racing. This was not how things were supposed to happen. She was supposed to negotiate with the human, not fight beside him. And yet here she was, following a man who had killed an enemy soldier in the blink of an eye. Her fingers tightened into fists. She had always been taught that humans were unpredictable, reckless, dangerous. And yet, as she followed Ryan's steady footsteps through the ruined halls, she couldn't help but notice how calm he was. Even now, with war raging around them, he moved with the confidence of someone who had been through this before, someone who knew what he was doing. Zira hated that she found it reassuring. She clenched her jaw, pushing those thoughts aside. She was a princess. She didn't need a human to protect her. But if that was true, why was she still following him? The human way of war. Rand stopped suddenly, raising a fist. Zira almost bumped into him. She opened her mouth to ask what he was doing, but he turned his head slightly, silencing her with a sharp glance. He was listening. Zira held her breath. A second later, she heard it too. Footsteps. Multiple. Approaching fast. Ryan exhaled slowly. 3, maybe 4. Zira's eyes widened. "How do you know?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he reached down, pulling a small combat knife from his belt. "Stay behind me," he said. Zira bristled at the command. "I can fight." Ryan didn't argue. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Prove it." Zira hated how easily he got under her skin, but before she could say anything, the enemy arrived. 4 Drakh warriors stormed into the corridor, their armor glinting under the emergency lights. Their black eyes locked onto Zira and Ryan immediately. One of them bared his teeth. "Kill the human first." Ryan moved before they did. Zira had never seen anyone react so fast. 1 second he was standing still. The next he was already on the first Drakh, his knife flashing in the dim light. He sidestepped the enemy's attack, twisting behind him in one fluid motion. Before the Drakh could react, Ryan buried the knife in the back of his skull. The body dropped. Zyra's heart slammed against her ribs. The second Drak lunged at Ryan with a plasma blade. Ryan ducked, spinning low, then slammed his elbow into the enemy's gut. As the Drak staggered, Ryan twisted his stolen rifle around and shot him in the throat. 2 dead, just like that. The remaining 2 enemies hesitated. For the first time, Zyra saw something in their eyes that she had never expected to see in a Drak warrior. Fear. Ryan didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. One of the Drak snarled and charged. Before Zyra even thought about what she was doing, she moved. She grabbed a fallen plasma blade from the floor and threw herself forward. The Drak didn't expect her to attack. He barely had time to block before she spun, driving her knee into his side. The impact sent a sharp pain through her leg, but she ignored it. Zyra struck again, slicing at his exposed arm. A shallow cut, but enough. The Drak roared in pain. Ryan finished him with a single brutal strike to the skull. The final enemy turned to run. Ryan grabbed Zyra's plasma blade and threw it with terrifying precision. The Drak collapsed mid-step, the weapon buried deep in his spine. Silence. Zyra stood there, her breath ragged, her body tense, her mind spinning. The fight had lasted less than 10 seconds. She turned to Ryan. He was already looting the bodies, checking for more weapons, as if this was just another day in his life. Finally, he looked up at her. "You handled yourself well," he admitted. Zyra swallowed. She wasn't sure if that was true. She had fought before. She had trained with the best warriors of her kingdom. But this had been different. Ryan didn't fight with honor. He fought with efficiency. Every move was meant to kill as quickly as possible. No wasted motion. No hesitation. For the first time in her life, Zyra understood something terrifying. The stories about humans were wrong. They weren't just unpredictable. They weren't just reckless. They were lethal. And Ryan Cole was the most dangerous of them all. A moment of understanding. Ryan pulled the knife from the last body and wiped it clean. Then he turned to Zyra. "We don't have much time," he said. "They know we're here." Zyra forced herself to focus. "Where are we going?" Ryan nodded down the corridor. "Armory's this way. You need proper weapons if you're going to keep up." Zyra bristled. "I can keep up just fine." Ryan gave her that infuriating smirk again. "We'll see." Zyra exhaled sharply, but followed. As they moved, she found herself glancing at him, studying the way he walked, the way he never let his guard down. She had spent her whole life training, preparing to lead her people. And yet, in just a few minutes, Ryan Cole had shown her an entirely new way of fighting. A way that was not about honor or tradition, but survival. Zyra had always believed her people were strong. But now, walking beside this human warrior, she felt something she had never felt before. Uncertainty. And, deep down, something even more dangerous. Respect. The battlefield test. The armory was close, but so were the Drak. Zyra and Ryan moved quickly through the palace corridors, their steps silent against the cold metallic floor. The walls bore fresh scorch marks from plasma blasts, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and blood. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the halls, followed by the sharp, guttural roars of the Drak warriors. Zyra tightened her grip on the plasma blade she had taken from the fallen enemy. Her body was still tense from the last fight, but her mind was sharper now. She had never fought like this before. Raw, fast, and brutal. But she had survived. More importantly, she had proven herself. Ryan moved ahead, his posture relaxed but never careless. He walked like a predator, someone who expected danger but didn't fear it. Zyra hated to admit it, but she was learning from him. She had always believed in discipline, strategy, and honor in battle. Humans, however, they fought like survivors. No wasted movements, no hesitation, no unnecessary risks, just results. And now, with her palace under attack, she needed results. The first real test. Ryan slowed near the next intersection, raising a closed fist. Zira stopped instantly, pressing her back against the wall. He motioned for her to stay put, then leaned forward, peeking around the corner. A second later, he pulled back, expression unreadable. 6 enemies, he murmured. They're guarding the entrance to the armory. Zira frowned. 6. That's not many. Ryan gave her a flat look. Not many for what? 4. Us, she replied, realizing her mistake too late. His smirk was infuriating. Glad to see you're getting cocky, princess. Zira felt heat rise to her face, but before she could respond, Ryan pulled something from his belt and tossed it toward her. She caught it instinctively, a small rectangular device with a blinking red light. What is this? She asked. EMP charge, Ryan said. Throw it. It disables their shields and weapons for a few seconds. Zira raised an eyebrow. You carry explosives. Princess, I carry everything. He reached for his stolen plasma rifle and checked the charge. You ready for this? Zira hated that he kept asking that, as if he expected her to fail. Instead of answering, she pressed her lips into a thin line, then, with a flick of her wrist, tossed the EMP charge around the corner. The instant it landed, Ryan moved. The firefight begins. The EMP detonated in a silent burst of blue energy. The Drakh warriors roared in confusion as their weapons and shields flickered and failed. Ryan was already in motion. He stepped into the open and fired 2 precise shots, dropping the first 2 enemies before they could react. The remaining 4 turned, scrambling for cover, but Zira was already rushing forward. She ducked under a wild plasma blast, leaped onto a fallen piece of debris, and sprang forward, closing the distance too fast for the Drakh to recover. The nearest enemy swung a heavy blade at her. Zira twisted midair, avoiding the strike, then drove her plasma blade deep into his exposed side. The Drakh choked on a scream. She didn't hesitate. She twisted the blade and yanked it free. 3 left. Ryan took one down with a clean headshot. Another tried to charge him, but the human sidestepped smoothly and slammed the butt of his rifle into the enemy's skull. The Drakh dropped, dazed, and Ryan finished him with a single brutal shot to the chest. The last enemy turned to run. Zira was faster. She lunged, grabbing the fleeing Drakh by the back of his armor. He turned, swinging wildly, but she dodged the strike and slammed her elbow into his face. The Drakh staggered, growling in pain. Zira didn't stop. She planted a foot behind his knee, forcing him to stumble, then drove her plasma blades straight through his throat. The Drakh gurgled, clawing at the wound. His black eyes locked onto hers, wide with shock. Then he collapsed. Silence. Zira stood there, breathing hard. The fight was over, and she had won. The human's approval. Ryan walked over, stepping past the fallen bodies without a glance. He stopped beside her, arms crossed, watching her carefully. Not bad, he said. Zira exhaled, feeling the last of her adrenaline fade. She straightened, wiping the blood from her blade. I told you I could fight, she muttered. Ryan gave a small, approving nod. You did. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. But you were still slow. Zira whirled on him, eyes narrowing. Slow. You hesitated on the last guy, he said casually, stepping past her toward the armory doors. Took too long to finish the kill. Zira opened her mouth, then closed it. She hated that he was right. Ryan pressed his hand against the security panel, scanning it. The armory doors slid open, revealing a massive chamber filled with weapons, explosives, and armor. He stepped inside, glancing over the stockpile. All right, princess, he said. Time to gear up. Zira gritted her teeth, forcing down her frustration. She had proven herself. She had fought just as hard as him. And it still wasn't enough. Fine, she thought. She would learn. Not just from her own training, not just from her people. She would learn from him. And the next time she fought, she wouldn't hesitate. Not even for a second. The warrior's challenge. The armory was silent, but the war outside was not. The distant echoes of gunfire and explosions vibrated through the walls, a brutal reminder that their fight wasn't over. Not even close. Zira moved through the rows of weapons, her eyes scanning the shelves. Plasma rifles, energy blades, tactical grenades, tools of war, neatly arranged, waiting to be wielded. She should have felt at home here. Instead, she felt frustrated. Ryan's words from earlier still burned in her mind. You hesitated on the last guy. It shouldn't have bothered her. She had fought well. She had survived. But the way Ryan had said it, like a simple fact, like she had made a mistake, it made her blood boil. She grabbed a plasma pistol from the rack, checking the charge. Her hands were steady. She was not weak. But she wasn't like him. Not yet. The human's arsenal. Ryan stood across the room, moving with calm precision as he checked his weapons. He had already chosen his gear, a sleek black rifle, a combat knife, and something that looked like a small explosive pack. Zira couldn't help but watch him. Everything about the way he moved was effortless. He didn't just carry weapons. He owned them, like they were a part of him. His fingers worked quickly, checking ammo, adjusting settings. His expression was unreadable, focused. A soldier preparing for war. Finally, he spoke. You're overthinking again. Zira stiffened. I am not. Ryan didn't even look at her. You're gripping that pistol too tight. She glanced down and realized he was right. Her fingers were tense around the handle, knuckles white. She loosened her grip immediately, annoyed that he had noticed. He finally turned, leaning against a metal crate, arms crossed. You fought well back there, he admitted. Zira raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment? Ryan smirked. Don't get used to it. She sighed, turning back to the weapons. I need something stronger. Ryan pushed off the crate, walking over. He scanned the shelves, then reached for something near the top. A pulse rifle. He held it out to her. Try this. Zira hesitated before taking it. The weapon was heavier than she expected, its grip solid, well-worn. Military grade, Ryan said. Custom recoil dampeners. Good stopping power. Zira ran her fingers along the barrel. It felt right. But then she narrowed her eyes. Why are you helping me? Ryan shrugged. Because I need you alive. Zira frowned. That's it. He smirked again. Pretty much. She hated that answer. But she didn't have time to argue. Because at that moment, the lights flickered, and the entire palace shook. The betrayal. Zira and Ryan turned toward the door as a deep explosion rumbled through the halls. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling. Then, a voice came through Zira's communicator. A voice she knew. Princess, forgive me. Zira's blood ran cold. It was Commander Velkur, one of her father's highest-ranking officers, a man who had sworn to protect her. And he had just betrayed her. Before she could respond, his voice continued. The palace is lost. The Drakh have offered us survival in exchange for surrender. The High Council has agreed. Zira's heart pounded. No, that's a lie. I wish it were. Ryan tensed beside her. He didn't know Velkur, but he knew what betrayal sounded like. You should come quietly, princess. It's over. Zira gritted her teeth. The palace was not lost. She was still here. She was still fighting. And she was not surrendering. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. Knew this would happen. Zira snapped her gaze to him. What? This is how it always starts, he said. First, the politicians make deals. Then the soldiers get left behind. There was something in his voice, not anger, not surprise, just disappointment. Like he had seen this before, like he had lived it. Zira turned back to her communicator. Her voice was ice. "You are a coward, Velkur." A pause, then a sigh. "If you will not surrender, then I cannot protect you." The transmission cut off. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Ryan spoke. "They're coming for you now." Zira already knew. The warrior's choice. Ryan slung his rifle over his shoulder. "All right, princess. What's the plan?" Zira inhaled sharply. Her people had turned on her. The Drakh were closing in. The safe choice would be to run, to escape while they still had time. But Zira was not going to run. She had fought for her people. She had risked her life to protect them. And now, they had abandoned her. Her hands tightened into fists. She wasn't just fighting for her kingdom anymore. She was fighting for herself. She turned to Ryan, her eyes burning with new determination. "The High Council may have surrendered," she said, "but I haven't." Ryan studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good," he said, "because I'd hate to do all this work for nothing." Zira almost smiled. Almost. Then she reached for her new pulse rifle and checked the charge. The next time she fought, she would not hesitate. Because now, she wasn't just a princess. She was a warrior. And she was ready. The final betrayal. The halls of the palace were empty. Too empty. Zira could feel it. The stillness, the waiting. The absence of her people, her guards, her kingdom's defenders. Gone. Surrendered. She had always believed that honor and duty were unshakable, that the warriors of her race would fight to the last breath. But now she stood in the ruins of that belief. Her own people had betrayed her. And the Drakh were coming. A war already lost. Ryan moved beside her, scanning the hallway with sharp, practiced eyes. He had been quiet since Velkur's betrayal, his usual smirk gone. Zira didn't need to ask why. Ryan had seen this before. He had lived this before. She glanced at him, studying his expression. There was no anger, no shock, just a cold acceptance. "Does it always end like this?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Ryan didn't answer at first. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, checking his ammo. Then, finally, he spoke. "Someone always makes a deal." Zira frowned. "And you don't?" Ryan looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "I don't make deals with people who sell out their own." His words cut deeper than she expected, because she wasn't sure if he was talking about her people anymore, or about her. She looked away, her grip tightening on her rifle. It didn't matter. Not anymore. She wasn't surrendering. The first attack. A metallic clang echoed through the palace. Ryan stopped instantly, his hand raised in a silent warning. Zira stilled, focusing. Footsteps. Heavy. Multiple. The Drakh were moving through the corridors, searching for them. Zira's heart pounded. There were too many. Ryan exhaled, shoulders shifting slightly. They know we're here. Zira gritted her teeth. Then we make them regret it. Ryan glanced at her. Then, to her surprise, he grinned. Now you're getting it. She didn't have time to question what that meant. Because the Drakh were here. They came from both ends of the corridor. 8 of them, armored and ready to kill. Zira raised her rifle. Ryan moved first. A flash of movement. He dropped to one knee, fired 3 shots, and the first enemy went down. Zira followed his lead, taking aim and shooting at the second. The Drakh roared, his shield flickering but holding. Ryan was already moving. He grabbed a grenade from his belt and threw it down the hallway. It detonated instantly, the force knocking 2 Drakh warriors off their feet. Zira took the opening. She rushed forward, plasma blade in hand, closing the distance before the nearest Drakh could recover. He swung at her, a heavy strike meant to crush her ribs. She dodged, spinning low, then drove her blade into his exposed side. The Drakh choked, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Zira didn't hesitate. She yanked the blade free and slashed again, this time at his throat. The enemy collapsed. She barely had time to breathe before another Drak charged her. Zara turned, only to see Ryan stepping in front of her. He didn't stop moving. He caught the enemy's arm, twisted it violently, and used the Drak's own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. Then, without a second thought, Ryan shot him in the head. Zara stood there, chest rising and falling, pulse racing. It had lasted seconds. Ryan turned to her, rifle still raised. "You good?" Zara blinked. Then, to her own surprise, she smiled. "Better than good." Ryan smirked. "That's what I like to hear." But before they could move, a deep, rumbling voice filled the hallway. "Impressive." Zura's smile vanished. She knew that voice. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a Drak unlike the others, taller, broader, and wearing the royal crest of the Drak Empire. Commander Raxer, the Drak commander's offer. Ryan lifted his rifle instantly, but Raxer didn't flinch. The Drak leader held up a single clawed hand. "If I wanted you dead, I would have sent more than just warriors." Zura's pulse spiked. He wasn't lying. If he was here alone, it meant he wasn't here to kill. He was here to talk. Raxer's black eyes focused on her. "Princess Zara, you are more resilient than your people." Zura glared. "And you are a coward for attacking my home." Raxer chuckled. "It is not your home anymore." The words hit harder than she expected. Raxer gestured lazily toward Ryan. "And you, the human." Ryan tilted his head. "And you, a lizard." Zura almost laughed. Raxer did not. The Drak commander took a slow step forward. "You cannot win this fight, princess. Your kingdom has already surrendered. Your people have accepted our rule." Zura's hands tightened into fists. "Not all of them." Raxer's black eyes gleamed. "No, not all. Just the ones who matter." The weight of the words settled on her chest. "Velker, the High Council, her father." Ryan exhaled sharply beside her. "I hate politics." Zura didn't speak. She couldn't, because Raxer wasn't wrong. She had no army, no reinforcements. All she had was a human soldier with a smirk and a rifle. And herself. Raxer must have sensed her hesitation. He tilted his head. "There is no shame in surrender, princess. If you lay down your weapons now, I will allow you to live." Silence. Zara's heart pounded. She could do it. She could walk away. Live. And yet, she thought about the fight. About Ryan's words. "I don't make deals with people who sell out their own." Zara breathed in. And then, before she could think twice, she lifted her rifle and fired. The plasma bolt whizzed past Raxer's face, missing him by an inch. The Drak commander did not flinch. Zara held her ground. Her voice was steady. "I am not my father." Ryan grinned. "Now that," he said, lifting his own rifle, "is the best thing you've said all day." Raxer exhaled. "So be it." Then he lunged. The human fury. Raxer lunged. Zara barely had time to react. 1 second, the Drak commander stood across the hall. Calm, controlled, unreadable. The next, he was moving with terrifying speed, a blur of muscle and power. His claws slashed through the air, aiming straight for her throat. Zara twisted away just in time, the wind from his attack brushing against her skin. She stumbled back, raising her rifle. Too slow. Raxer was already on her. His massive hand closed around her weapon, wrenching it aside. The strength of the impact nearly ripped her shoulder from its socket. Zara gasped in pain. Her grip failed. The rifle hit the floor with a sharp clang. And then, suddenly, Ryan moved. The human strikes back. Ryan did not hesitate. While Zara was still recovering, the human soldier had already closed the distance. He moved differently than the Drak, not with brute force, but with precision. His body twisted mid-step, his combat knife flashing in the dim light. He struck low, fast. The blade sank into Raxor's side, just beneath the armor plates. A weak spot. A soldier's instinct. The Drakh commander roared in pain, staggering back. Ryan didn't stop. He followed the attack with a brutal elbow strike to Raxor's jaw, then a sharp kick to the knee. The Drakh leader snarled, swinging his arm. Ryan ducked, not back, but forward, into Raxor's guard. Then he drove his shoulder into the commander's chest, sending both of them crashing through the nearby wall. The power of a human warrior. Zyra stumbled back, coughing as dust and debris filled the air. The impact had torn straight through a reinforced metal panel, leaving a gaping hole in the corridor. On the other side, Ryan and Raxor were already locked in battle. And for the first time in her life, Zyra saw true human combat. Ryan fought differently. He wasn't just trying to overpower Raxor. He was adapting. His movements were fluid, shifting with every attack, a constant calculation. Raxor was bigger, stronger, but Ryan was faster, smarter. He didn't try to match the Drakh's strength. He used it against him. Every time Raxor swung, Ryan sidestepped just enough to avoid the full force. Every time the Drakh commander tried to grab him, Ryan would shift and counterattack. It was relentless, precise, unforgiving. The way only a human fights. And for the first time, Zyra understood. This was why the galaxy feared them. Why the Drakh spoke of humans as unstoppable warriors. It wasn't because they were the strongest. It was because they refused to lose. The turning point. But Raxor wasn't finished. The Drakh commander suddenly changed tactics. Instead of trying to overpower Ryan, he shifted his weight, letting the next attack hit his armored shoulder on purpose. Ryan's knife barely sank in before Raxor's tail whipped around, slamming into the human's ribs with brutal force. Ryan grunted, stumbling back. Raxor seized the opening. His massive clawed hand wrapped around Ryan's throat, lifted him off the ground. Ryan's legs kicked, his grip tightening around his knife, but Raxor squeezed, crushing the air from his lungs. Zyra's breath caught. She saw Ryan's teeth clench, his body twisting in pain. For the first time, he was losing. Raxor grinned, his sharp teeth glinting. "You humans fight well," he rumbled, "but you are still only flesh, and flesh breaks." Ryan's grip on his knife weakened. Zyra's heart pounded. She had seconds to act. She saw Ryan's eyes meet hers, and she knew, if she did nothing, Ryan would die. The princess becomes a warrior. Zyra moved. She ignored the fear, ignored the pain in her body, ignored the doubts screaming in her mind. She moved. Her hands grasped the fallen plasma blade from the floor. She charged forward. Raxor didn't see her. His focus was on Ryan, on crushing the life from him. That was his mistake. Zyra let out a fierce cry, raised the blade, and plunged it deep into Raxor's back. The Drakh commander stiffened. His claws loosened. Ryan fell to the ground, coughing hard, gasping for air. But Zyra wasn't done. She twisted the blade, deeper, harder, forcing it through armor and flesh. "You talk too much," she hissed. Then she ripped it free. Raxor shuddered, his massive body swayed. Then, with a final guttural breath, he collapsed. Dead. The battle was over. The aftermath. The silence that followed was deafening. Zyra stared at the fallen body, chest rising and falling, her hand still gripping the blade. She had done it. She had killed him. Not as a princess. Not as a diplomat. As a warrior. A ragged cough snapped her attention back. Ryan was sitting against the wall, rubbing his throat. He still looked like hell, his lip bleeding, his armor dented. But he was alive. Zyra rushed over, kneeling beside him. "Are you?" "Fine," Ryan grunted, waving her off. "I've had worse." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not comforting." Ryan smirked, voice rough. "You did good, princess." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not because she had wanted his approval, but because, deep down, She had earned it. She took a breath, looking around. The palace was still burning, but the Drakh had lost their leader. The battle was turning. Maybe they could still win. Maybe this wasn't the end. She looked back at Ryan. What now? Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his messy hair. Now. His eyes glinted. Now we see how many of them we can kill before breakfast. Zyra laughed. For the first time that night, she wasn't afraid. And for the first time in her life, she was ready. Because she was no longer just Princess Zyra. She was a warrior. And with a human by her side, the war was just beginning.